Hello, everyone. My name is David Paquette, where I'm the Associate Director of Research for Mass AITC, and welcome to today's session of the webinar series supported in part by the National Institute on Aging. This is the second to last session before we take a quick 2-month hiatus before starting back up in the fall. So thank you for joining. As a quick reminder, Mass AITC is a member of the National Institute on Aging's AI and Technology Collaboratories for Aging Research, which many of you colloquially will know as the A2 Collective. Last month, our session focused on delineating a roadmap for building AI systems that effectively scale from pilot scale validation testing to large scale real world deployments in aging environments from the clinic to the home. Today's speaker follows by discussing the roadmap his team is taking or has taken to this point from initial pilot scale co-design, ideation, and MVP generation with older adults and caregivers to commercialization plans through a national primary care network. So hopefully he'll expand upon that more in his own introduction to a session. And the brief bio, today's speaker, Tim Ken Mackey, is the CEO and co-founder of S3 Research, a public health data science company originally created from a challenge.gov award. He is also an adjunct professor in the Global Health Program at UC San Diego and the editor-in-chief of JMIR Infodemiology. He has co-authored over 290 manuscripts on topics including global health, technology, data science, substance use disorder, and health policy. Dr. Mackey is an entrepreneur and scientist working on technology innovation to address healthcare challenges, including developing tools and systems to encourage equitable participation and engagement in clinical research. As he's also a recipient of Mass AITC Pilot Award funding via the A2 Collective Pilot Award competition, which is part of the focus of today's talk. A few housekeeping rules. Our speaker will present approximately for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A and general discussion for the audience. Feel free to enter your questions into chat, or if the Q&A function is available, as they arise during the course presentation, and we'll get to them sort of in the order received at the end. So with that, take it away, Tim.
Great. Well, first, thanks, David, for the invitation, and thanks to the Mass ATC group, because it's been a really great partnership with you guys, and we're really excited to present this project, which is called TrialChat, and is another one of those multi-agentic tools that everyone's developing, but one that we very purposely developed with our users in mind, which are older adults and caregivers. Again, our project's called TrialChat, and it was focused on developing an agentic AI chatbot to encourage older adults and caregivers to participate in clinical research. This is a project that was that we carried out with our partner at California State University Fullerton, sorry. And my co-I is also on the call, Joshua Yang. And so we've been working together for almost a decade now, doing a lot of different projects that really focus on digital health tool development, but with co-design and user-centric design approaches at the forefront. So we'll talk a little bit about how we went through this process of co-designing the chatbot, the lessons we've learned, and also some of the early commercialization activities that we're doing as part of our transition into in SBIR that we've been funded for as well. So as a quick presentation agenda, we'll talk about TrialChat itself and the A2 pilot project, which is the inception of this tool. And again, I can't reiterate enough that the A2 pilot project collaboration is what enabled us to develop the tool in the first place, and then transition to other sources of funding as well. We'll talk about that transition to commercialization, which includes things like pivoting your product, looking at the market landscape, and trying to figure out how you can create something unique that is something that's unique and meets patient and clinician needs, particularly when you're talking about AI tools that are rapidly evolving over time. And then the next steps component, we'll talk a little bit about what our transition has been to our current SBIR, which is a phase 1, also with the National Institutes on Aging, and how that's changing the kind of trajectory of the technology and the commercial development that we're pursuing. So the problem that we're trying to address is something that I think a lot of you are very familiar with, and that is the difficulty it takes to actually enroll people into clinical trials. And that's specifically a challenge for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. These are populations that, depending on their disease state or their condition or their awareness of clinical trials, may not have access to any information or may not be actively being recruited into trials. So this is a patient population that's very difficult to access in the first place. One of the other things that's very crucial about any type of clinical trial recruitment is making sure that we get diverse and equitable recruitment in these trials so that the trials actually represent the population that they're serving. So that's another aspect of clinical trial recruitment and a bigger problem that cuts across all types of disease areas. So we're also trying to address clinical trial diversity and equity at the same time. One of the things I've been telling investors, trying to get them interested in this idea, is the fact that we are trying to address a problem that's upstream to a lot of their investments. So you can imagine a lot of the disease-modifying agents that are being developed in the healthy aging space or Alzheimer's space, a lot of the digital diagnostics, those type of things, all are generally going to require a clinical trial to assess their efficacy and safety. And without those, it's really a bottleneck that means that a lot of those innovations may never actually come to market and help our patients and our communities. So we're trying to address this very acute issue that I think cuts across the whole innovation pipeline. Some of the major challenges with not enrolling enough people into clinical trials or the right type of candidates, such as diversity and equity and underrepresented populations, is of course the actual cost of the recruitment, which can be very, very expensive, all the way to $90,000, depending on the type of trial. Making sure, again, that we are not at 11% of our trial participants that are from diverse backgrounds, but we're actually getting a higher percentage because that's what is reflective in the population of people that are actually impacted by these diseases. And particularly Alzheimer's disease, you're seeing a lot more prevalence in diverse communities as well. And then, of course, the actual economic cost of this, which means that any delay where a sponsor can't get adequate enrollment in a clinical trial could mean that they're losing the opportunity to present that into the market and make money off of it. So a lot of our investors in this space were saying, you need clinical trials, and a lot of your things that you're investing in aren't getting to market because they can't enroll enough people into clinical trials. So that's the big area we're trying to address. And despite the fact that we have a lot of investment and innovation in this space, and that there's a modernization of clinical trials going on, particularly with recent announcements from the FDA about real-time monitoring of clinical trials, the actual process of recruiting for clinical trials is relatively antiquated even to this day. So these are some of the traditional forms of recruitment that are going on, like a flyer you might see in an academic medical center, advertisements on buses or other mediums that are very traditional media format. Sometimes you see personalized ads. So I'm half Japanese, and I get a lot of Japanese-related clinical trial recruitment flyers from Facebook, for example. And then, of course, online community groups that try to enroll people into clinical trials as well. These are generally good tools, but they're often not specifically personalized for the complex information seeking that someone does to actually think about enrolling in a clinical trial. It's a pretty big decision to make. A lot of people don't have much information about what a clinical research study is or what its purpose is, and they may not have any information about it. So one of the things we're trying to do is modernize the way we do recruitment for clinical trials in a way that people seek information about research and their disease area. And in addition to this, we're trying to align this with a broader movement towards the rise of decentralized clinical trials, which place clinical trials in places that are not like an academic medical center, but actually more in the community or in places where people can access clinical trial opportunities closer to their home, such as their primary care provider, et cetera. So those are the two types of areas we're focused on: clinical trial recruitment and enrollment, and also aligning that with decentralized clinical trials. So here I'm going to talk a little about the project itself, and we named the project TRIALCHAT. Relatively easy to understand. Sounds like a chatbot, and essentially is something that we're trying to build to engage people in a different way when it comes to clinical trial participation. As I mentioned, problems are very acute in this space. So some of the previous studies that we've done have shown that people don't even know that a clinical trial exists. They don't know what the role of a clinical trial is. They may learn about clinical trials from like a medical drama, like Grey's Anatomy, for example. So they have very little information about what a clinical trial is, its purpose, or where they're located. They have difficulty finding information about clinical trials. There is, of course, clinicaltrials.gov, but I wouldn't say it's the most user-friendly approach to searching for clinical trials and translating that to why you should join or enroll into a clinical trial. And a lot of patients, specifically in our underserved populations, don't trust certain forms of information resources. And so they're really looking for mediated information that can, break down some of those barriers when it comes to enrollment and participation. So those are some of the things we were trying to address. With this particular project, we had three very specific aims to build this tool. One was to build a comprehensive US-based ADRD clinical trial database from clinicaltrials.gov. Aim two was to develop a matching algorithm that would pair with an LLM-powered chatbot for personalized recommendations, and we can get into why the design framework was set up that way. And then three was to actually develop the minimally viable product, or the MVP, using a user-centered design approach and a co-design evaluation. And we'll go into each of those specifics in just a second. So the first part's not too difficult. You take clinicaltrials.gov, you mine it, and then you transform that data and you create a relational database that can then be very specific to being ingested through an LLM or a matching algorithm. So you take all those features and all those characteristics that are in clinicaltrials.gov, you reorganize them, you transform them, and we make them readable for our LLM, Agentic LLM, and also for our matching algorithm, which I'll get into the next step. And of course, we did this for all clinical trials in clinicaltrials.gov, but we focused on a subset that were, of course, related to Alzheimer's disease, that were US-based. And then because we were doing our co-design sessions in California, we took a group of those in California that we wanted to test with our initial tool. The second component was developing a matching algorithm, and this is separate from the development of the actual multi-agentic AI tool. This was a feature-based classifier and also had rules-based features components to it as well, and a ranking system. So it takes those features of a clinical trial, assesses what the user's preferences are, and then ranks clinical trials based on those preferences. And what we wanted to do here was one thing related to architecture, which is cost. So if you have an LLM do all of these things for you, you're running up the token cost for that solution. So running a feature-based classifier or a rules-based classifier can be cheaper, more lightweight, and essentially can allow you to scale this process with a cost kind of analysis in mind. So that's part of the reason why we built this with the way we did. And again, some of the workflow for this is a user makes an input, the LLM detects that there's an intent to want to match or enroll in a clinical trial. A structured request is then sent to our trial database query. The matching algorithm then ranks those trials. It returns that personalized result to the conversational agent, and you get it translated in a conversational standpoint versus in like a data filtering standpoint. So this was something that was very important for us to develop. It's part of the kind of framework and the architecture. And then moving on, we were able to develop the multi-agentic AI framework that sits around that particular matching algorithm. And then the one thing we're excited about that matching algorithm is it's flexible to match to other types of healthy aging services where we're looking to expand upon, and I'll talk about later on in this presentation. But in parallel to the actual technology development, myself and my co-I, Joshua Yang, we really believe that you should talk to users first and figure out if they actually want to use these things to begin with before you do really robust development of a technology solution. And in the space of generative AI tools, I think there's still a lack of user-centric approaches to building chatbots. And all of us have kind of been forced to be prompt engineers and actually adopt a singular UI, UX kind of model for generative AI tools, even though no one actually asked us if that's the experience we want. So we're trying not to make those mistakes, but actually talk to users before we actually build these tools. In support of that, Professor Yang did key informant interviews, first to not really introduce a tool, but just talk about what are expectations about technology, clinical trial education and information, and what are caregivers' needs and older adult needs. And so what we found, one of the key insights there was awareness about these requirements, including clinical research, are relatively low. But then when caregiving begins, those needs become very intensive and they change over time. In addition to that, we did some co-design sessions where we took 16 participants and we walked them through an IDEO design framework. And we talked about things like what should your user interface look like? What type of privacy considerations do you think about when you interact with these tools? What type of options or what type of experience or workflow do you want? And we showed them a prototype of the tool, a very early prototype, and asked them to kind of evaluate it to a certain extent. And so some of the main things that we learned from that co-design session was a lot of our older adults and caregivers are using AI. They're not always satisfied with their AI experience, their generative AI experience. They want clear information and organization. They want to be able to navigate very easily. And they want very specific matching approaches to get them to the trials that they're looking for. And the initial prototype we developed did not do those things when we showed it to them. So of course, in any type of digital health design, you're going through a lot of iteration. So these are some of the challenges we've identified, and I think they're translatable to people that want to build generative AI tools for any population. Really doing co-design sessions and learning what people's interaction and expectations are for these tools. So one was conversational clarity, making sure that your navigation is clear and that you know what the chatbot is going to do. A lot of people get frustrated because they're prompting a chatbot and they're not getting the answers they want. So we have to make that process faster and more efficient. So that's one thing that I think even generalized chatbots don't do well. A lot of times we're having a hard time getting the answer we want out of a chatbot. A lot of personalization in the UI UX component, making sure that when you start your chat, that the chatbot knows who you are. Are you a caregiver? Are you an older adult? Are you someone else that is looking for information? What is the point for your session? Are you there for education? Are you there to match to a clinical trial, etc.? So doing presets like that so the chatbot has some working knowledge of where you're coming from and what your context is. Some visual applications that we'll talk about later, and then accessibility issues that are very simple things like increasing the font size of a chatbot that are actually hard to do in a lot of existing chatbot applications. So after that co-design session, we went through the process of course, developing the MVP. It was developed within the Stack AI framework, which is an open framework to allow for multi-agentic AI tooling. It has multiple LLM agents. Some of them do intent detection. Some of them guide people through educational materials. Some of them interface with our clinical trials database, and some of them route that person to the trial matching algorithm. So they're all working in different roles, and they're all there to create a cohesive experience for the user so that they can navigate both information seeking, matching to a clinical trial, and learning more about a clinical trial, and potentially enrolling in a clinical trial as well. One of the things that we focused on after we built that MVP was doing another set of initial user testing and feasibility testing with 6 participants and seeing how they liked the chatbot compared to the prototype we developed. And the main results were, the best results you can get out of a initial user and feasibility testing is they liked it, they could use it, they could actually match to clinical trials. They asked questions about what were the next steps. They still had a lot of things they wanted to improve about the chatbot, but we were getting much, much closer to something that someone would actually use and be okay with when sharing information about their particular condition, about what their loved one's going through, and also actually trying to find a clinical trial that would be of interest to them. So we have some initial data that's coming out of that we're looking to publish, and we also are optimizing that tool, which I'll talk about in the next part of the presentation. So this is the chatbot TRIALCHAT MVP. This is a very short video just to show you some of the capabilities. We didn't want to make it too long, but here's an example of what you see on the launch page. So instead of just having a generic chat function, users wanted to have very clear navigational pathways of what the tool does. So here you have 2 options. You essentially can learn more about Alzheimer's disease, which is an educational component of the chatbot, or you can go straight to matching to clinical trials. And so what we learned in our co-design, our KIIs, and our initial user testing is that some people aren't interested in learning about clinical trials. They're interested in learning more about Alzheimer's disease and research. And then once they have that information, they can then navigate towards, is a clinical research study a good fit for myself or for someone I'm taking care of? So you can't just force people onto ideas. You have to navigate them based upon your information seeking. So there's crossover between these 2 modules. So if you learn more about Alzheimer's disease and now you're interested in research, you can cross over and learn more about clinical trials. For some of our users, they already knew exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to learn about the clinical trials near them, and they just want to click this button to get as close as they can. So you can click one of those buttons. This is the educational component. And one of the main things that we really thought was important is that when you ask a question of a chatbot, it can give you an answer that's relevant to your question in your prompt, but it should also give you pathways to learn more about the topic with related questions. And so, of course, what is powering this is a knowledge base and a RAG that ensures that people only get correct information about Alzheimer's disease and related materials, but also gives you very relevant questions so that you don't have to prompt the LLM. You can just click through these questions as you go. And if you find out you want to match to a clinical trial, you can just click that button at the top and match to a clinical trial. Another thing we learned in the privacy component of our co-design is that people do not want to share a lot of information. So some of the information that they're willing to share are things like age, their gender or sex, and also zip code. So these are very non-discrete personal information. Most people were comfortable with sharing this type of information. So that's the matching features that originally start the tool to run. Sorry, let's go to here. So I can just show you how that then matches. You find clinical trials near you. So then it will rank those clinical trials. And of course, if you want to provide more information about your disease state or even filter into clinical trials, you can as well. But you don't start with that information. You start with the minimal amount of information that we can create a search and match for you. Of course, it lists the clinical trials in a kind of conversational component. And then also it's going to have those same questions here that can lead you to more information that you're interested in learning about a clinical trial. And these are questions we learned from our co-design are questions that people actually want to ask. And if you want to contact the site itself, you can also get the contact information for the site. Most of the people we talked to indicated that they were not interested in us facilitating enrollment. They would rather do that themselves. They just wanted information because they weren't as comfortable sharing information directly with the chatbot about their eligibility. And then there's a lot of other things you can do here. You can actually create a table that compares different clinical trials. You can learn more about the eligibility criteria like this question does here. You can filter it for things that might reflect whether you're eligible or not. There's all types of things you can do. We don't have time to show it all, but these were things that our users said that they were interested in when developing this chatbot. So we are, the A2 pilot was really focused on developing a chatbot, very purposely developed to match people to clinical trials. And what the outcome was a fully developed platform called TRIALCHAT that is very specific to ADRD trials, a matching algorithm, and of course the multi-agentic environment that allows that matching to occur. This project has been presented at APHA, American Public Health Association, HIMSS, a large health informatics conference, the symposium for A2 as well. And we're also working on doing more dissemination activity for clinical research related conferences in the future. And now what I'm going to get into is kind of like the next steps, like the practical application of this. A lot of us in the research side of it, and I'm a professor at UCSD still, so I do a lot of research, but I do a lot of commercialization on the company side. A lot of times we think we build some tool. We went through all this process of actually talking to patients, so it should work. It should be commerciable, but there's a whole other process we have to go through to figure out what the actual commercial market is for it, what other additional changes we have to make, whether there's large pivots to the tool we have to do, and that's the phase we're in now. Fortunately, we were awarded an SBR phase 1 from NIA to further develop this tool into something a little different, which I'll talk about again in the next part. So the next part of this discussion is what I hope is going to be more fun for a lot of the participants on the call. And of course, if you guys have questions about the very specific technical specifications of the chatbot, how to build it, the process we went through, we can talk about all of that. And we also have one of our engineers, Marco, who's on the call, who can answer some of those more specific questions for those of you who are interested. But what we're going to transition now into is like, you built the tool, so what? Like, can you actually sell it? Is someone actually going to use it? And what's the actual commercial and business model to support it's actually coming to the real world? And that's something that I think is actually more difficult than people think, particularly for people who are transitioning from research into kind of startup and entrepreneurship. So first, market analysis. We have to figure out what's out there that already does something close to what we do or represents itself as a similar solution. So for Alzheimer's disease, what type of tools are out there to help you match to a clinical trial? Well, one, clinicaltrials.gov, a government website you can go to and you can look for trials there. Or two, something like this, which is Us Against Alzheimer's, a large patient organization that serves Alzheimer's patients. They have something called CareBox, which essentially asks you to enter in a whole bunch of information about your inclusion-exclusion criteria. Have you had diagnostic screening? Are you taking any type of medications, et cetera? A lot of personal information. And then what it does is it outputs these cards that summarize clinicaltrial.gov information and then allow you to connect to a clinical trial navigator, a real-world person. So this is obviously a little different than what we've developed. It's not conversational or it's not LLM in its function, and it does not have some of the elements that we looked for in the co-design approach. The educational component is separate from the actual matching. So this is one thing that tells you that at least within the Alzheimer's space, there are not like purposely developed tools to match people to clinical trials. That does not necessarily mean it's commercial, but it means that there could be a gap that we can address because existing tools are not available. And some of those things that we learned in the co-design session, here are some pictures of the co-design and the initial user testing, are things we're carrying over into version 2 of TRIALCHAT. So one is that, most importantly, people are willing to use AI chatbots. And older adults and caregivers are already using them. So we want to give them a better experience when it comes to learning about Alzheimer's disease than using a generalized chatbot like ChatGPT or Claude. We want to make it easy. So we want to make it easier than a chatbot in the context of, if you want to look for a clinical trial, come to us, don't go to these generalized models. We want to create more UI/UX principles. So a lot of our users want filtering and other features that we need to build into the UI/UX of the chatbot, so the chatbot has features that normal chatbots don't as well. And then there's other things we're trying to do, such as creating memory within the chatbot. So you can memorize your sessions, you can go back and forth. Maybe at one point you're at a certain level of cognitive decline, and at another point you have different needs and services. So having that ability to have memory and embed things like screening tools are also things we're going to be working on in version 2 that are focused again on patients and caregivers. And so the value propositions you make for this tool is that it provides a single source of clinical trial information specific to ADRD. It reduces some of the complexity and decision burden because you can search for information easier in a conversational way, and that it's very specifically geared towards matching to clinical trials, unlike other conversational agents. And for research institutions and sponsors, who are the people that may pay for a tool like this, you're looking to improve their recruitment pipeline and make it more efficient and cost effective. But at the same time, some of the things we're really interested in is if we can figure out a matching tool for clinical trials, which people generally don't want to participate in, we can also do this for other healthy aging services. So in our SBIR, we're also looking to expand this tool to match to other things that you experience when you age. I tell this story all the time because it's very personal to me, but when my father was going through his Alzheimer's disease, me and my mom had to find him a long-term memory care facility. And so that was an immediate need for us. We didn't know much about the area. And so we learned a lot of that through organic networks, through local Alzheimer's chapters. But if we had a tool to help us match to a long-term care facility with memory care, or if we needed adult daycare for one day, it would have been great to have a tool like this. So fundamentally, the technology has the ability to match people to where they're at in their cognitive decline journey, and then match them to services that are appropriate for them with this matching algorithm. We just have to swap out the databases, create new knowledge bases, and also create specific prompts that lead people to those resources that they need. And so those are some of the things that we'll be working on in the next phase of this project. There were some other things that we also built in, some accessibility features. So we have a voice-to-chat option on TrialChat, but very few people used it when we were doing initial user testing. But accessibility issues are another thing that we'll be exploring in more detail as we move forward. So that kind of gives you an idea of like how much of a landscape assessment have we done for patient-centered tools. So now let's move on to how many tools are out there, not necessarily for Alzheimer's clinical trial recruitment, but for any form of clinical trial recruitment that is also using an LLM tool or any type of artificial intelligence. And it turns out within the scope of our time doing the A2 project, a number of these tools have been developed. And that's the problem with the space is technology is rapidly improving. Maybe a foundational model even gets good enough to do trial matching. And now they're a competitor, for example. So you have to constantly be monitoring the market to see what the developments are in the space. So we did a market landscape view of what other clinical trial tools are out there. There's one called TRIALCHAT. It is patient focused. It doesn't have core chat functions, but it kind of exports data the same way in these cards. And it has a lot of different inclusion-exclusion criteria. Of course, this is for all clinical trials. It's not just for Alzheimer's trials, but this is an example of a tool that similarly filters data and has like kind of a chatbot on the side to give you more information, but they're not integrated together. There's one called Trially that uses EHR and EMR data, and it mines that data for patient trial recruitment. So it's looking for electronic health record data that says that this patient is more eligible for clinical trial than not. Really amazing tool if you think about it, because you're getting very high quality data and very good qualified leads for those clinical trials. But of course, you have to get access to EHR, EMR data, which is very difficult. So kind of a separate use case. There's also something called TrialGPT. Yes, very similar name to this commercial offering that was developed by NIH actually. And so it's not conversational. You have to paste in medical notes, and then it summarizes trial eligibility from that information. It is on NLB's website, so some patients may not feel comfortable sharing that information on a government website, for example. And again, it's not really focused on a dynamic chat function. It's more input-output type of approach. So some of the summary we got from this market analysis is that almost all these tools are patient-specific. So they're targeting people and saying, where are the clinical trial opportunities available for you? They have limited chat function. There's nothing specific to ADRD trials, and none of them, from what we could tell, were actually co-designed with the user population in mind. So those are some things that you take away from your development and you say, this is how our product is potentially differentiated from some other things, even if the core technology may be very similar. But one of the most important insights that this told us about was that no one is focusing on clinician-focused recruitment with clinical trial applications. So what this has allowed us to do and kind of informed us to do is pivot not just from a patient-centered recruitment approach, but also to think about how can we use this tool with clinicians and other healthcare providers who may be in a better position to suggest someone to join a clinical trial because they know more about their disease area and their condition. And so we're going to take the same framework. It turns out that clinicians also aren't well educated on clinical trials, and some of them are very hesitant to even recommend their patients to clinical trials. And so educating clinicians about clinical trial training and recruitment opportunities is also very important in building another framework for this trial chat solution. The same matching algorithm can be used, but it has to be positioned a little bit different when you're matching for a healthcare practitioner who's recommending a patient versus a patient themselves. So we're working through those tools as well. And then how do you actually gain access to clinicians? Well, this is something where a company like ours looks for strategic partnerships. And so we are now entering into a strategic partnership with something called the Achieve Network, which was created by a colleague of ours at FDA who left FDA. She was the acting commissioner for minority health there, and she was let go. And now she's brought her network that she built over 20 years of affinity organizations and different patient and clinician organizations, and she's trying to build out a decentralized clinical trial network. So she has a network of over 40,000 clinicians nationwide, and we're looking to deploy this tool with their members in exchange for them gaining access to training materials and other incentives to refer people to clinical trials. So part of this is identifying a market need. There's not many clinician-focused recruitment tools out there. 2, finding a strategic partnership. And 3, retooling the solution for that particular use case and looking at whether we can gain entry to that beachhead market on a very innovative product. So similar to the design, you're still going to have that ADRD database, but what we'd like to do in the next phase is enrich it with data from sponsors, CROs, and other partnerships. So instead of having a static clinicaltrials.gov database, you're actually enriching that data with additional information about the trials that can help people match better. The matching algorithm can be very similar. We might swap out RAGs or knowledge bases for particular end users, but architectural-wise, it's very similar. And what we're going to be doing is doing the same thing, doing co-design with physicians and healthcare practitioners, nurses, et cetera, and finding out what their expectations are about a tool, and also learning more about what the expectation is of a patient when a clinician talks to them about a clinical trial. Like, what information do they want their clinician to want to know about a clinical trial itself? So here's just a quick mock-up we did for some of our customer discovery, which I'll get into a little bit later on, which shows a demo we did for Walgreens clinical trials, their group. We wanted to show how a physician can kind of click this button here on Trial Chat, figure out the communication style they want, find a suitable trial for them. And this was a trial that Walgreens was running at the time, so we used one of theirs as an example. And essentially, it populates a clinical trial that's run by Walgreens. That maybe a physician isn't aware of and maybe has a patient that is eligible for. And then they can refer that patient through outside of the EMR system through a referral process that happens outside of the clinical informatics system. So that's just an example of what we've been showing to some sponsors and some CROs about how this integration tool could work and how it could reach clinicians in a different way than their patient-centered approaches to recruitment. Okay, so this is the last part of my presentation. I know I've been talking for quite a while, so really looking forward to any questions or comments you guys may have. And of course, I hope this is as much a learning session for us as it is for you. But the next session, we'll really talk about like what are the next steps for the company and how do we get to where we are today. So confession, we are a company that was created by the SBIR program. So in 2018, we entered a challenge.gov award after winning a hackathon that HHS was holding for the opioid crisis. And we won a little bit of money to create a company. And so me as a professor at UCSD, all I know is, research grants. All I know is that the university takes it. We pay an overhead, and then I do the research at the university. Completely new to me in that these challenge.gov awards said, stipulation of the money you receive is that you have to create a company. So we created a company, and then we went through a process with NIDA's program officials to learn how to submit an SBIR application. And so we were successful in submitting what's called a phase 1 and phase 2 fast track application from NIDA to commercialize technology primarily to address the opioid crisis through online surveillance of illicit drug sales. So that's how the company was created. Through that process, we went through something called, that many of you guys already know about, which is I-Corps. So we were part of the NIH I-Corps 2020 cohort, and we learned the hard way that in order to commercialize something, you have to talk to a lot of people. So we did 120 customer discovery interviews, and we focused down our kind of product and our beachhead market, and we were successful enough to translate that technology, and now we're primarily a government contractor. So we do a lot of work with FDA. We work with private companies as well on this primary use case of illicit drug sales online. During that process, we were also fortunate enough to work with FDA through a cooperative agreement to start the process of building recruitment tools for clinical trials. And actually, the first project we had was for the opposite population we're working with right now. We originally had a research grant to build technology tools for young adult populations and encouraging them to participate in clinical research. From that came 2 studies I just post here, but more importantly, established with us a working relationship with FDA and the person we're working with right now who left the FDA to continue to build these tools now for Alzheimer's disease. I can talk a lot about the SBIR program. It's an amazing program if you know how to navigate it. It's non-dilutive, of course. It gives you a lot of opportunity to build technology very purposely for public health purposes. And that's one of the things our company prides ourselves on, is we're not just building technology tools for profit, but we're also building them for some public health or healthcare need. So the kind of commercial history and funding history is that we were formed in 2018 through this challenge award, received that phase 1, phase 2, started building out that architecture for a lot of what we're doing now, and we're fortunate enough to get funding from the FDA to build those initial prototypes, learn more about clinical research in the context of recruitment, and then awarded the pilot award from A2, which bridged us over to the phase 1 SBIR. And so now we're really in the commercialization phase. We are making sure that we build the tool purposely for our patient user segment, but also looking at other use cases like a clinician focus segment, and also aligning it better with decentralized clinical trials, and more specifically, building strategic partnerships and talking to potential customers about what that product needs to look like. So far, we raised $850,000 in non-dilutive capital funding, for healthy aging tech. And that's just one way to approach commercialization. Obviously, there's VCs, there's seed funding, there are accelerators, there's a whole universe out there. But this is just one example of how to commercialize product, primarily through the SBIR program and other accelerator programs that are non-diluted. So the next steps for us are to take what we've built in the A2 Collective pilot and really focus on who's going to buy it, who is going to be our strategic partner, and what is the tool set that's needed around this core functionality of a chatbot. So the chatbot will be one very critical component of the solution, but it's likely not the sole solution that we're building. And we'll talk again a little bit about that in the next few slides. Some of the things that were great about A2 is they actually get you in front of investors. They get you strategic partnerships with other parts of the A2 Collective, like other collaborating centers. They have a lot of contacts. A lot of those can be customer discovery themselves. Of course, there's a lot of resources out there. And so it's like a mini boot camp for SBIR, because a lot of SBIR companies actually don't do this groundwork. So it's great prep for an SBIR application. So if any of you guys are thinking about submitting SBIR phase 1, you've actually done some of the work if you utilize the resources that were available from the A2 Collective, and you're probably going to be in a better position to get that funding awarded. One of the things we did was we engaged with the Johns Hopkins University business students to just get some initial business evaluation, and they gave us some good ideas for pitch decks, for market analysis, things like that we just didn't have the bandwidth to do. So that was an amazing resource that we were able to tap into as well. Again, now we're focusing on this clinician-centered workflow and trying to figure out within the SBIR, we have a patient product, but now we have to build that clinician product as well. And the funding has given us the opportunity to look at those two use cases independently and see how they integrate as a holistic ecosystem as well. The strategic partnership integration is very important to us. So sometimes you need money, sometimes you need partners. So some of the partners we're talking to are the same organizations we talked about. We've talked to Us Against Alzheimer's, and they're very interested in a clinician-focused tool to augment what they have already. And we've done about 30 customer discovery interviews so far with our partner Achieve Network and also on our own. So that's the first step in prepping yourself for an actual solution you can bring to market. And then a final thank you to David, Professor Das, all the other people that have helped us through this process. It really accelerated us quite fast. And now in our phase 1, we're actually doing things that would be conducive to a phase 2, like really getting traction with the market to figure out what that tool should look like and who's going to be your first customer. So this is our team. I won't go into it too much, but again, Christine Lee from Achieve. We're very fortunate to a certain extent that people left government and now they're trying to do things outside of government. So there's a lot of capacity out there that is untapped. And so that's some of the things that we're doing. Also rounding out some of our consultants and our advisory board, some of the things that we just have to do to mature this use case that's independent of some of the primary funding we receive in the supply chain component of our solution. And so some of the other things we're trying to do is build the actual workflow for recruitment. This is getting into the details. And a lot of times these workflows are very client specific. So in order to develop a workflow, you have to talk to a customer and figure out where their pain points are, where their data is, and how you integrate that into a workflow that makes sense. So again, a sponsor registering their trial in our network, that trial tool then becoming available to them and allowing users to search for a trial within a network of clinicians that are using TRIALCHAT, and then an ability to do the handoff of actually referring that patient to a clinical trial. And in our case, we're actually going to be using a clinical trial coordinator that creates the referral package after a patient has matched to a clinical trial so that there's validation processes through. So what we're trying to do is create a way that people can register the trial on our system, match, get referred, and hand off successfully for a successful enrollment. And so here is an example of the ecosystem we've developed as part of the SBIR, which takes that trial chat and puts it into a larger ecosystem around decentralized clinical trials. So here, you would enter your clinical trial and its protocol. You could set the inclusion-exclusion criteria very specifically, so that would be something separate than what clinicaltrials.gov has. You could match to a physician that is in a particular area or location. Now the chatbot is in this window here, and a physician can use either the tool to search for a clinical trial or use the chatbot to search for a clinical trial as well. So the trial chat becomes one element of a larger engagement portal for a physician. And then, of course, the sponsors see their results when it comes to whether they're matching to a clinical trial or not, and how their recruitment goals look like. So we're developing this tool. We are working with a number of different customer discovery sponsors and CROs to see if this would be like the best match for them. And we're pretty close to gaining some really good traction. We have a few contracts out there that are being negotiated that we may be able to get traction on. But of course, customer discovery and customer acquisition are long pipelines. So they take a long time, but we are in the process of doing that with a few potential customers. So I'll end there. I'm at about 43 minutes. Just want to say again, thanks to David and everyone, and looking forward to any questions you guys may have, especially if you are interested in submitting an SBIR. I'm a very big proponent of the SBIR program. We're here because we have government agencies that have invested in our company and our technology and believe that we are trying to build technology that isn't met with current commercial needs. But of course, the challenge of that is when it's not commercially available, sometimes it's hard to bring to market. So those are the things translation-wise that you just have to learn through experience. And some of that experience has been through our first SBIR program, but now is, we're trying to mature through this new use case with clinical research recruitment. So we are looking for strategic partnerships. That's always a very important thing when you're in an SBIR program. You want to build those strategic partnership and networks to support future grant funding opportunities, and of course, to identify who your customers may be in the future. So with that, I'll end. And again, thank you for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you, Tim. Let me unpin. So there's a couple of questions in Q&A. I'll start with those in the order they've been received so far. So Alyssa Hong, I think in the initial section on the A2 collective portion of the development, sort of had a question around originally who are the target users of trial chat related to, actual people living with ADRD. And so, how would those types of people use the apps, or sort of how do you balance the co-design at that stage between potentially the caregivers and the ADRD patients? And, sort of like how would, in that ecosystem, how would someone, sort of find about the app? And then I think so we can start with that, and then the next set of questions sort of transition more into the clinical workflow.
Yeah, I think the first question is very important for us. So we initially thought a direct-to-consumer model is probably the best approach for trial chat, which means that there'd be some instance of trial chat publicly available to a user, and that they could freely access it and then match to a clinical trial. And then someone on the sponsor side or the CRO side is the one actually subsidizing the cost of the system. So that initial use case was, let's design it for the patient and the caregiver, and let's do those design frameworks separately because a caregiver is going to have different needs than a patient. And then let's figure out who might pay for the patient to access that, rather than, a direct consumer model where the patient has to pay for a subscription model, things like that. Just didn't think that was viable at the time. So that's something that we now are trying to figure out. Is there a sponsor model where a sponsor will want to include their clinical trial with enhanced data? And because of that, and there's a group of people that will be part of that network that are using the app, then of course, that's why a sponsor will want to pay for a license fee or things like that. So that's kind of the general model we've approached. And then that would make the product publicly accessible. Versus something else could be that the trial chat tool is kind of built out specifically for a set of sponsors or a CRO. So it's like a private labeled product. So when a clinical trial or CRO site needs to recruit patients, this is simply another tool that is accessible to them and includes their trial information. The knowledge bases may be more specific to the trials that they're running. And there might be even multiple trials that they have, like a CRO may have 20 trials that they're administering at the same time. So that's another model we're developing as well. And what we're trying to do with validation is we're trying to do customer discovery and business hypothesis testing to figure out who is actually going to pay for this and what is the price points, things like that. And that's where customer discovery and actually doing customer acquisition kind of proves out those business hypotheses. And so right now, I'd say we're in like 3 different segments. We should be in 1, but we're getting traction in 3 different segments, but none of them have actually equated to a finalized contract, which is what we're waiting for. In reality, for a lot of startup companies and even small businesses like us, whoever gets us there first is probably who we're going to initially develop the technology for. So if a CRO decides they want to run it, then we will probably build the technology more explicitly for them, and the engineering gets a little bit more customized for that particular use case. So I hope that answers that question. If you want to talk more about why specifically we focused on caregivers versus patients, again, we think they're very distinct population groups. One of the things we're learning is that, younger caregivers, people that are maybe not the primary caregiver, but someone younger in the family, might actually be the best person to use the tool and refer them to clinical trials because of their familiarity with AI tools. We're also learning that, maybe digital literacy and health literacy may take into account whether someone may use these tools. So that component we may have to build in as well. So a lot of different things we're trying to explore in that space. But I would say like not many of the tools that we see are even customized for a caregiver versus a patient versus a clinician.
Yeah.
And Josh, do you want to add anything to that? I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add to that comment.
No, I think you got it covered.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay, so sort of a follow-on or sort of questions related to the expansion, thinking about trial chat. Sort of how do you sort of balance it for different types of clinical trials, sort of either being focused versus sort of what, like a wider, type of clinical trial clientele. I guess it's just sort of the databases. So that's a question. Maybe tying that into, there's obviously a US model for clinical trials is one model. Have you thought about, other markets like European or other countries? So I guess maybe quickly those two, and then we can circle back to hopefully if we have another time for another couple questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So related to the first question, I would say it's kind of like a hypothesis. Like if you build a very generalized tool that from a technology standpoint, I don't think it's hard to make this tool apply to any clinical trial in any disease. But then you have to also create very specialized knowledge bases for particular disease areas. And frankly, some people and some types of trials, they may not have as hard of a time recruiting, or it may not be as lucrative to recruit patients for particular types of trials. So I think what we want to focus on are trials where we have the most difficult in recruitment and where the stakes are the highest, even if the tool has flexibility to address lots of different trial recruitment requirements. And this is kind of a question of where generative AI tools are going. You have these generalized LLM tools that are supposed to do everything. And now we're going to get into these domain-specific generative AI tools that are very, very hyper-focused and maybe fine-tuned for very specific use cases. And is there a commercial market for an ADRD only clinical trial bot? We think yes. So if that's the case, then we should continue to develop within that segment and not get too distracted across a whole use case of every single clinical trial you're trying to recruit for, or kind of start to expand into other healthy aging use cases or neurodegenerative use cases instead, because the trial space may be kind of similar. So, and then within the Achieve network, there are specific physicians and clinicians that make up those networks. So giving the tool to specific clinicians that have specific patients is also a matching process we're going to go through as well. That lends itself to a very much more specific use case than making a generalized tool, to be honest. So we're kind of taking that approach. Whether that's the right approach, I think we'll figure out through actual customer acquisition or not.
Yeah.
And then the second question about international trials, it's a little difficult for us at this point because there's going to be different data requirements for GDPR in Europe. A lot of trial recruitment pipelines are tougher in the US than they are overseas. The FDA only allows certain number of clinical trials that are occurring overseas to meet your enrollment criteria. And the vast majority of clinical trial spend is still in the US. So we still think the beachhead market is US, if you're talking about geography, and then you segment it out into different disease areas. So Europe is not something we're thinking about, also because of the privacy requirements, although we're trying to make this tool something that you wouldn't share a lot of data with. So those are some things that the reason why we just don't have time right now to really think about other markets yet.
Alrighty. And then there's three questions in the chat, so maybe you can rapid fire these in the last 2 minutes. You mentioned sort of, there's a question from Starwin Gornell talking about how are recruited clinicians advocating for these clinical workflows for clinical trials to other colleagues and clinicians, or sort of how's that being approached? The ask is because they're part of a team who was recruiting clinicians for chronic condition with a mobile app. So sort of, how to think about advocating and how to scale within clinical systems.
Yeah, I think a simple question is like, why would a clinician use a trial chat tool? They're busy. They got other things to do. They're probably not interested in clinical trial app at all. So what we're doing is the strategic partnership with this with Achieve is that they also gain access to training to become a potential clinical trial site. So that includes something called CGMP training. And in order to be a trial site, you have to go through that training. So that training is provided for free if they use the tool. And then the clinicians then gain access to the training, but also gain access to the tool to match their patients to a clinical trial. So there has to be some sort of incentive for physicians to participate in any type of tool, and it has to match with their clinical practice. We also think that it's probably not physicians who are going to use the tool, it's probably nurses. And so nurses are in a better position. Actually, Professor Yang's doing a lot of work with nurses right now, figuring out where nurse navigators are the best people to talk to when it comes to clinical trial opportunities. So it may be that a clinician then provides this tool to their frontline staff or a clinician or a nurse navigator, and they are now using it to help match the patient to a trial, and they're receiving an incentive. And part of the thing we're trying to do is also train nurses to become part of the decentralized clinical trial network by being able to become clinical trial sites. So there's a whole separate workforce discussion going on. And that's the interesting thing when you develop tools, like lots of ideas come about. Ideally, we would be focused on one use case and we wouldn't be spread across. But the customer discovery is leading us to lots of use cases, and we just have to find the first one, our beachhead market, that gets us to that first product.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we're at time, but if you one more, so this question related to, maybe we can follow up on some of these later, recruiting participants for the UX co-design and user testing. So that's probably refer to Josh if they want to talk about that more.
Exactly.
And then maybe just quickly in 30 seconds, ethical principles or frameworks reference for building tools. So how are you thinking about guardrails and maybe risk within clinical settings if it's being used to refer participants?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question, then I'll hand it over to Josh for the recruitment component of UX and co-design. So the first quick answer to that is ethical principles are sometimes built into these commercial LLMs. So you can decide whether you want to use an ethical AI framework that, for example, AWS uses. We're primarily an AWS company, so you can rely on those, and sometimes that's commercially acceptable, although there are black boxes. Or you can kind of purposely design it. So in our context, it's really about the RAG and the knowledge base. So we're starting off with a pretty limited knowledge base that has very curated information. So we know that the model will not hallucinate when it gives advice. And we're giving the model very limited functionality to search online for certain topics that are included in the knowledge base. So you're gating it appropriately to very specific information. But the problem is when the user is looking for information that the knowledge base can't answer, it's either giving them no answer at all, or it's going to an online source and that information could be misrepresented. So we're matching what people are searching for, and we're rerouting our knowledge base to incorporate questions that can't be answered by the knowledge base and filling in our knowledge base iteratively. So I could explain it later on, but essentially that's how we're building kind of the knowledge base to make it more gated and more appropriate for patients is learning from their search queries. Ethical principles are somewhat different, but again, you can rely on some of the commercial ethical frameworks that are out there Or you could build your own knowledge base around that also. So Josh, I think you got the last question here.
Yeah, we partner with two groups. There's an Osher Lifelong Learning Institute chapter here at Cal State Fullerton, and they were instrumental in helping to recruit people, older adults, into our study. We also worked with Alzheimer's OC, who made known who passed out recruitment materials among individuals in their support groups. And so those were the two main sources from which we recruited for our co-design and user testing sessions.
Alrighty. Well, thank you. We're a little over time, but thank you for the 20 the group of you that stayed on, and we appreciate the questions, and thanks to RLS. Happy Older Adults Month, Americans Month. We'll be in touch, and we'll pass out recordings if you registered, and if you want to get in touch with Tim Mackey or Josh, you can find their information online, and we'll also send that out with the email. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.